This chapter is about developing systems. It starts with an interesting discussion about you really have three choices when you're developing a system. You have insourcing, where you do it in-house, right? This is in-house development, using the resources you have internally. Then you have self-sourcing, again, which is using internal resources, but it's the users of the system. It's the end users who are not necessarily technologically savvy. You should provide them tools and give some assistance. And then you have outsourcing, which is where you look to a third party for providing the work for you. So that's really either a consulting firm, or there's various versions or ways to create alliances for outsourcing, and we mentioned that in the article. So the first thing we talk about is, if we are doing in-house development in sourcing, there is a traditional waterfall method. It's called the Systems Development Life Cycle, or SDLC. It's a highly structured step-by-step approach for developing information system. It has 7 phases, and you can see here the 7 phases and hundreds of activities really associated with each phase. One of the issues with SDLC is that it's very long, it's very intensive, and can take a very long time, and that's been one of the complaints over why there's been so much innovation on these methodologies. But it is a methodology, it's an approach, and the goal of any kind of development approach is to reduce error to control the development activities. More than half of all the developmental attempts, software development or system development attempts, fail. They either fail because they are overcost, or they don't meet the goals, or they don't deliver on their objectives, or by the time they are finally developed, they are obsolete. Millions, almost billions of dollars annually are thrown away by poor development attempts. And so the goal of any kind of development methodology is to try to control for that kind of risk and control the development activities, so it's got some structure, and it gives a project manager certainly a way to make sure that they're staying on track. So the SDLC, like we discussed, 7 phases and a lot of activities associated with each phase, which you can see here from planning all the way through maintenance. Everything is outlined here. We're going to highlight just a few things. You can see why they call it a waterfall model. It's because each phase leads to the next. So you start with planning, and here what you're trying to do is, what is it that you're going to create? Should you create what you're doing? The IT project you're going to develop, the system, does it match something that's critical to the organization's success? Is it something that you should be doing? Is it important? And that's a question you definitely ask when you're doing planning. The second part of this planning is very important, sets the tone for the entire development cycle, and that you're setting the project scope. You're setting what are the system requirements, and here you're trying to do things such as set boundaries so that you don't run into something called scope creep, where the project just keeps getting bigger and bigger as you work with the users of the system, the future users of the technology. They're going to give you feedback as you go through this process about features and capabilities, and maybe even other interfaces the system should be able to work with. And you'll never finish what you start if you don't control the scope of the project or the features of the project. And here's where you want to create a document that describes the project scope. And a good project manager is very good about keeping these types of projects confined and on track. Otherwise, you're doomed to failure. So it's important now, and that too early. And then you put together this project plan. So what's being done, who's doing it, when are the timelines, what is the budget, all of those things. What technologies are required, and put together the team, who is involved, who is going to lead the efforts, and what are the key milestones. You need small successes along the way. So the second phase is analysis, where you start talking to the people who are going to be using the system and the people who are going to be developing the system, and get them to talk to each other and start putting together what it is the system is supposed to do. And this is where you start gathering the business requirement. Who's going to be doing what with the system, who's involved, and it's working, what should it look like, and you put together these requirements. What is it that the system should do? What are the requirements of the system? and you want users to sign off on this document. So again, this is control and scope where you say, well, we've heard your voice. We understand what you want and sign this so we can get working, and we're not going to increase the scope. We're not going to add new features or add new capabilities. And this little graphic here shows you, as you move forward in the SDLC, you see the costs associated with each element increases. If you don't fix them, errors at any step early are going to impact the system later for sure. You don't plan appropriately, your maintenance costs are going to be very, very high, because when you start getting into maintenance, you're actually not maintaining, you're actually continuing to develop. The design phase, this is where you actually design the system. This is where you put together the technical blueprint, what technologies are involved, and how does the infrastructure or architecture actually work. This is where, as a developer or a project manager, you're going to take lots of participation role and you're going to service a quality control role, making sure that your IT people are already designing systems that meets the need. So you're really monitoring at this point. The development phase is where you actually take the design document, the pseudocode or whatever it is you have, your blueprints, and you create the system. This is where the technology is actually coded, goes from documents to actual digital artifact at this point. This is the part of the SDLC that if there's going to be any outsourcing, this is usually where it will start, because at this phase you have documents and anybody who can code in a particular language, Java or whatever the project's going to be developed in, they don't necessarily have to be so connected with the organization. Up until this point, you really have to know the organization. How can you understand an organization's key competencies if you are not a part of the organization or have not entrenched yourself in some way? So, the early part of SDLC certainly is very difficult to outsource. Consulting firms have to spend quite a bit of time with an organization to understand the capabilities and the requirements of the system before it can be developed at this point. Testing phase, it comes back into the organization if they ever left. It could stay inside the organization, and that's fine. Testing is where you're going to put it in front of some people. You run through some tests, some pilots. You can do some unit testing where you bring in little pieces of it and test it as you build it. Integration testing brings it all together and makes sure it works, and then user acceptance testing obviously is what that says. You're going to put some users in front of it and make sure it's doing the things they needed it to do.